Okay, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here today at the Circle event and a chance to speak. I brought my phone up just to check my time, but also that I've had my text message back already, which said I know, but I didn't realise you did. There you are. So anyway, Angela and I are going to speak for 40 minutes. What I'm going to do is I want to talk a little bit about visioning a gender equal economy. And in particular, I want to talk about the economy, the economic strategy, inclusive growth, and how gender plays into that, both as a constraint and an opportunity for Scotland if we can address it. So that's the topic. My slides won't work, but the slides are available for people anyway, so I'll talk ignoring the slides, and Louise has the slides anyway, so that's the key point. So I suppose what I want to start with is what you measure matters. And I know Angela will talk a little bit about feminist economists, but actually what you measure matters. And a lot of the economy focus typically is on GDP, so gross domestic product, the value of all goods and services produced. And that narrow focus and the limitations of that have been addressed for a number of years by a number of critics. It's important in the context of gender because it excludes a lot of activity that's done out with the kind of formal sector of the economy. And so what we're saying was what you measure matters. And typically in the economy, when I start a talk, I look at the structure of the economy in Scotland. So there's two pie charts here showing the economy in 1973 and 2016. And what the pie charts show you is essentially the value or the structure of the economy based on GDP, which is the value of goods and services produced in the economy. And why that's important in one sense is that's the formal measurement of economic activity in the economy. And when I do this talk, I often say to people, we use these pie charts to explain how the economy has evolved over 40 years. You can look at essentially the 1970s, the economy was much more even in terms of services and production. Scotland had a larger manufacturing sector. You then think about what happened through the 80s, globalisation, changes, the growth in the service sector. From a gender perspective, interesting, the 70s, 1970s Equal Pay Act, 1975 roughly around employment rates were just over 50% for females in the UK, and around 75% of females worked in the service sector. So the 70s, very much that occupational segregation was there. You roll forward to 2016, we've got largely a service sector economy now. The manufacturing production part has dropped quite a bit. But usually when I do this at business organisations, I say to them, what's missing from the pie charts or what's not included? And most of them say it's oil, or oil's missing, because this is the onshore economy. But what I want to highlight here is obviously what's missing from GDP is the non-formal parts of the sector. So just by way of a quick illustration, this is data published by the ONS in 2014, which looks at using a time and use survey, which looks at the non-market aspects of GDP or the activities that take place in the household. And essentially the headline is that if you included the non-formal sector, which is typically delivered by women, it would add $1 trillion to UK GDP and increase it by around 50%. So there's a well-established debate about GDP and what it measures and what it doesn't. And this type of work is really useful for that. So childcare here is estimated at over 300 billion in that context. So GDP, so you can do these types of changes to accounts and modify the accounts. What I would argue is actually the National Performance Framework, moving beyond GDP, looking at a range of indicators and outcomes is much more powerful in that regard. But anyway, so the first point is what you measure matters. And as Louise said, we do a lot in data analysis, and actually the understanding the data, the story, and what the constraints are is really, really important. So let me move on to Scotland's economic strategy, if you like. So in March 2015, we published an updated economic strategy. I can describe this without the slides. So essentially there's two pillars to it. One's about competitiveness and the other's about reducing inequality. And this was quite a change from the earlier approaches, which were largely about competitiveness and growth. So addressing inequality has equal parity in it. And when we're talking about inequality, we're talking about inequality of opportunity, outcome, income, wealth, and regional inequality, where you live and how that impacts on you. And it was quite interesting when we published this in 2015, it got quite a lot of pushback initially. There was quite a lot of people saying, well, why are you talking about inequality in a growth strategy? And essentially that's changed over a very short period of time. Advanced economies are all talking about inequality, how it undermines social cohesion, and the constraints it places on the diversity and productive use of people within the economy. But I want to focus on a circle that's at the bottom there, this thing called inclusive growth, and what that, and how you kind of operationalise that, what you mean by inclusive growth. So in thinking about inclusive growth, what we are thinking about here is a different type of growth, a growth that basically promotes inclusion, is fair, is equal, and addresses the issues or constraints that people face. So in developing inclusive growth, we looked at the work of the OECD, and this is the example I want to try and get into, thinking about how it relates to gender and the dimensions. So if you look at an inclusive growth framework, you think about what are the characteristics of inclusive growth, both on inclusion and growth. And we developed a framework with 5 Ps: productivity, population, participation, people and place. And what inclusive growth allows you to do is look at the socio-economic and environmental constraints. A bit like Louise described an ideal model. Look at the constraints, the data. Think about the levers that you've got and where you would focus your economic activity. So we've used this approach both nationally and at sub-Scotland level as well. So nationally, we benchmarked Scotland against 9 other countries that were small advanced economies, to look at what the main constraints were, both in terms of inclusion and growth. So that was nationally. And interestingly, the constraints are listed. A lot of the constraints had a strong gender component. So one of them, if you take the top one, was around digital and skills in the workplace and who was training to be digital. So again, big issues around occupational segregation. The next one down was caring responsibilities, where the data showed that the UK was particularly skewed towards females providing most of the care, both for younger children and older, and also the cost of care, the cost of provision of care was another issue. So if you think about how that then feeds through into opportunities for females to participate in the labour market and other issues. So that was, if you like, that was the national element of it, and we have data that shows that both on the international comparisons, how the UK and Scotland fare on that, and also on the digital. The more interesting bit was applying it locally. So if you look at so we developed a diagnostic which you can apply to any local authority area in Scotland. You can look at how your local authority ranks across these criteria, and you can cut that by gender. You can look at the outcomes for females across a range of areas. So we did this in North Ayrshire as a pilot, and what was really interesting there was the gender dimension was really strong. Gender was a massive issue for the council achieving its objectives, both in terms of opportunities for female, social capital, mental health, and when you look at it as a system and the constraints in the system, you get a different type of feeling. So the data here is really important in understanding what's driving inclusive growth. And Louise touched on prioritisation. So there's a 6-stage process to this. We developed a framework that says, diagnose the problem, look at the constraints, have a prioritisation matrix. What do people care about locally? What do you want to change? and then combine your resources to do that. And essentially, what levers do you control? Because there's local, national, and UK. So in terms of policy coherence, there's a framework there that can be used to try and drive these issues within a wider constraint. The framework also links to the National Performance Framework. So it's important that there's a kind of North Star, and what we're doing on the ground links across that type of framework. So inclusive growth challenges for Scotland, we have many, both in terms of, in one sense, Scotland's a wealthy country. We can talk about being at the second quartile of the OECD in terms of GDP per capita or productivity, but there's massive variations in the performance across the country. We know the gender pay gap is still very prevalent. We know that in-work poverty is a real issue now, with more than 50% of working age adults in poverty in households with someone in work. And we know that life expectancy varies quite significantly across Scotland by as much as 10 years, depending on where you live. So if you take it, these are all part of a system, and the constraints of that system impact on each other. So Louise is 100% right in the sense that this is system change, and system change needs a different type of approach. It needs a different type of thinking, and you have to think holistically about how you do that. So in my role, our contribution is thinking about how the economy can help that system change, how you can come about to deliver that, how you can drive that type of change. So the example of the inclusive growth diagnostic is a tool that's been used now for city-region deals, for regional partnerships, and it's been used to try and influence and drive policy, so that at the very outset, you're starting with a diagnostic of what the problem is, rather than saying, well, it's this area, it's about economy, it's about population, and actually you're given the ownership of the problem back to your stakeholders and the people you're delivering. So that's really, really important in that regard. I've got loads of interesting slides, which I'm obviously not showing, in terms of gender pay gap, inequality, and different elements. But I think, coming back to the National Advisory Council on Women and Girls and the recommendations, for me the three big things that jumped out, that grouped around the recommendations, was the leadership role, accountability, and creating the conditions. So for me, the leadership role, I think the recommendation around the NPF, you can look at the NPF through a gender lens, and I think the recommendations reflect that the gender outcomes, whether justice, education, health, economy, are clear. So that's something that you can really, really do, and I would encourage you to do that using the frameworks that we've got. The accountability point is really interesting as well, because Angela will talk about actually how you move from kind of metrics to actions to actual budgets, and actually how you can drive some of that going forward. But for me, I think the key thing is the creating the conditions, and I think it's about changing the norms. So basically, so again, thinking about the economy, business sector, most businesses or business leaders compete within a sector. They take the sector norms for that sector, whether it's pay, how they treat suppliers, how they interact. So often it's about trying to get inside the firm, trying to think about how they react and try to change norms. And in a sense, that nudging of norms across a range of areas. I had the pleasure to be in Iceland last week with Derek Mackay, and they're a leader in gender equality. Their gender outcomes are quite outstanding, but they've changed the norms of their system. It's as Louise is saying, it's a kind of curiosity. Nobody raises an eyelid about it. It's much more central in that regard. So in thinking about economic strategy is very supportive of this agenda. It's about addressing inequality, competitiveness alongside each other. Inclusive growth has a framework that's data-driven, which allows you to cut it by gender, and it picks up on issues that are really important. The economic rationale for a gender-equal economy is clear. We are not using our resources properly. The constraints around occupational segregation, whether it's in the workplace, education, training, are there and clear. So it's really, really important that these are addressed. One final thing I'll just mention is an initiative which was launched again by the Scottish Government last year, which is around the wellbeing economy governance. And if you haven't seen, there's a great TED talk by the First Minister which was delivered in Edinburgh in August, and it's had 1.5 million views already, where she spends 8 minutes talking about how the economy has to change and has to deliver better outcomes for wellbeing. So we started this engagement both with Scotland, New Zealand and Iceland, and it's really about thinking about how the role of the economy in terms of driving wellbeing. And if you think of that through a gender lens, it's massive. It's massive, the challenges that are there and the opportunities if you get that right. Now, we had a policy lab in May which looked at how you move from performance frameworks to actions. We had officials from New Zealand talking about their wellbeing budget and how they're trying to use that to drive more collaborative government in New Zealand. We heard from the Icelandic officials about how they use data to inform and drive their positions. And we're committed to working with these countries to learn from practice elsewhere. And we have an annual policy event. And the one thought I wanted to leave you with is there's an opportunity there to actually put gender right at the centre of that as well, and have a look at how we're performing across those range of issues. So to sum up, if I can, the economic strategy is much more balanced around social cohesion, gender, inclusion, and recognising that it's part of a wider system. And unless we change that system, then you'll just perpetuate, the system will just continue to produce the results it produces. The challenge we have is moving from, in policy cohesive terms, moving from an outcome system that recognises that. And as Louise mentioned, at some point, you need a mechanism that trades off, because every outcome is desirable in its own right, but you need some way to trade that off. And what we've tried with Inclusive Growth Framework is a prioritisation matrix that you can use at the local level. And if you're interested, it's available on the Centre for Regional Inclusive Growth, and have a look at it and challenge it. But sorry my slides didn't work, so thank you very much anyway. Cheers.